Good morning to anybody that's tuning in on our YouTube video and anyone on the list line. We are going to go ahead and get started. Today we have Dr. Marjorie Piechowski, the Director Emerita of Research Support in the College of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She has 30 years of development and research administration. Earlier positions include Grant Information Specialist at Marquette University for 3 years, the Director of Sponsored Programs and Research at DePaul University for 17 years. And in these positions, she coordinated and wrote large-scale collaborative grant applications of individual faculty proposals to federal, state, private, and industry sponsors. She also conducts proposal development workshops across the United States and internationally, and has made over 80 presentations at regional, national, and international conferences. As an independent grant writer, she has written over $30 million of successful grants for a variety of colleges and universities, primarily for the U.S. Department of Education. For the last 20 years, she has reviewed proposals for the U.S. Department of Education. And she has also served in leadership roles in the National Organization of Research and Development Professionals, the National Council of University Research Administrators, and the International Society of Research Administrators, serving as president for both SRA International and the Midwest section. Her degrees include a BA and MA in English from Marquette University and a PhD in American Literature from UW Milwaukee. Marjorie is a proud alum of the 4-H program in Montgomery County and has great admiration for the value and services of county extension offices. So without further ado, here is Dr. Piechowski.
Thank you. So I see this as a chance to give back some of what I've learned over the years about grant writing. So let's start with the idea that none of us learned how to write a grant when we were in school. It's just not something that's taught. It's not something we get experience with. Perhaps you may have helped a professor with writing a grant, but it's just not something that any of us really were taught how to do. The problem is that once you get into a professional level job, grant writing can be an expected skill that you bring to the position. It certainly is a bonus if you know how to write grants. So here's the situation. It's challenging, it's difficult. Success rates can range anywhere from 5 to 20%, sometimes higher. So practice and patience are what it takes to become a successful grant writer. The other main factor is that successful grant writers don't give up the first time. They revise, they reapply, they keep going. And the success rate is much higher for reapplications. Now, to get a grant, there is fierce competition, but there are thousands and thousands of funding opportunities at every level, from very, very small grants to very, very large. So even a very small grant, a few $1,000s, can make a huge and permanent impact on your career, your office, your colleagues, and especially the public that you serve. So let's get started with the process. Why would you even want to write a grant? Well, because grants can support this huge array of projects. Most of the grant money in the United States is for research, but there's also a huge amount for programs, service delivery. And why do you do that? You want to augment or expand what you're already doing, or you want to develop new programs. If you develop new programs, almost all grants expect you to show how you're going to continue the program. You're not going to get a grant usually for a one-time shot. Grants also enhance your professional reputation. It puts you in an elite group of people if you can write and get a grant. And certainly in university situations and in extension, there is a tenure and promotion process, and grants are one marker of how you've done something that's different from your peers. So certainly there is some value in career growth and accomplishments. If you know how to write grants, you become a very valued employee. Getting a grant also allows you to do projects that possibly can be published, can be shared with other people. Sometimes you develop a pilot project that then becomes replicable for other organizations. So it expands what you can do to a much broader field. Many grants directly support people. whether it's students, whether it's families, whether it's the constituents you serve. So there can be a very direct financial benefit for getting a grant. And certainly getting a grant increases the visibility of your organization, your public image. And the main point of getting grants is you make a difference, whether it's health, education, jobs, quality of life, community services. You can save money, you can possibly even save lives. So there are all sorts of benefits in getting grants. They may be short-term, they may be long-term, but they're certainly worth going through the effort. So if you want to write a grant, there are a whole set of factors that result in a successful grant. And I'll talk about each of these as we go on. What you want is a successful grant. You want it well written, and you want a strategic budget. We'll talk about some of these issues. I'm not going to go into any kind of details about budgeting because that's so related to the grant opportunity itself and to your own circumstances. But a budget is part of a grant. So what do we need? We need a well-prepared applicant, meaning that the person who will be running the project is capable of doing it. We need the money, the available funding. That's a whole separate workshop in itself. Where do you get the money? How do you find it? You need supporting data, and this is something that sometimes deters people from doing grants. And you need some sort of newer creative idea. Nobody's going to give you money to keep doing what you're doing without some change. So let's look at these factors. So just a little bit on where do you find the money. Most of the grant money in the United States comes from the federal government in some way, about 90% of the available grant money. So the money is parceled out by some agencies whose whole mission is to do research. And you've heard of the National Institutes of Health. You've probably heard of the National Science Foundation. That's their job. They fund all sorts of grants to all kinds of institutions, and they have as their goal conducting research. There's also a lot of federal money from what we call the mission agencies. Now, Extension gets money from the United States Department of Agriculture, but there's also Department of Defense, there's the Environmental Protection, there is the Department of Energy, NASA. There's a whole set of mission agencies who have grant money. And so when you start doing your funding search, these are worth looking into. So the 90% is probably for grant applications, mostly located in the research agencies, but there's a fair amount in the mission agencies. So the grants work in two ways. The competitive grants are ones you write, you apply, you find a topic or a program, you put your grant together, you submit it. And you're competing with everybody else who submits. The other way that the federal government gives out grant money is money that's allocated or committed in a certain way. Some people call them entitlement grants, some people call them formula grants, block grants. The idea is that the money might be based on a population. For example, it might be based on school lunches, so a population of children from poor families. The money might be based on health. There might be a whole set of formulas that are used, but every state gets some what we call federal flow-through money. And it might be any one of these formulas or blocks or entitlements. There are also grants, though, that come directly from a state government. Wisconsin does provide some grant programs that are competitive, that organizations can apply for. There may be grants available from other governments, city, state, city, county, regional, and there are grants from international governments. So this is beyond the 90% from the federal government. Then there's a whole set of grants that are available from the private world. There are private foundations and there are not-for-profit organizations. This is probably a whole day workshop to dissect all of these private funders, but there are corporate grants. There are privately funded grants that may be an individual, that may be a family. Almost every large city in Wisconsin has a community foundation that funds projects that are locally based. And then there's a whole set of private foundations that are mission focused. You've heard of the March of Dimes. You may have heard of the Susan Komen Foundation for Breast Care. So there's a whole set of mission focused. There are ones that just have to do with child issues. There are those that have to do with population groups. So the search for funding sometimes can take weeks, but there's money out there for whatever your goal or your project is. Then business and industry often fund locally. So this is a whole separate funding approach. And then there are some individuals that provide funding for projects that are near and dear to them. So here's the array. There are literally billions of dollars out there in available grant funds. Somebody gets it, so it may as well be you. So if you're going to go into this world of grants, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of words and terms that are used. But I'll just go over a couple of them that have to do mostly with federal money. Any grant that's applied for is applied for by an organization. An individual cannot generally apply for a grant. So the applicant organization has to apply, and somebody in that organization has to certify and sign for that grant. So this is one of the key points to know, that you need to work within this structure. Almost every grant that's government money has a whole set of certifications and legalities that the applicant has to agree to do. Some grants will give money for what's called facilities and administration or indirect costs. So that's something you need to know if you're applying for a grant. Does this grant provide it? And if it does, then you ask for it. Any federal money is governed by a set of regulations called the Uniform Guidance. This has to do with what's eligible for grant support and how you spend your money, how you maintain your funds, how you conduct an audit. So this kicks in. Any grant that is submitted by an organization has to have a designated person who will run the project. In research, it's generally called a principal investigator. In a project or a service delivery, it's generally called a project director. And pretty typically, the grant guidelines will say what kind of person or what kind of eligibility or what kind of qualifications are required. How do you find out about the grants? Grant agencies send out notices that they've got money available. It might be called a request for a proposal, request for an application, funding opportunity announcement, any of these, and then there are other terms too. The idea is that if there's grant money available, the agency says, here is what we're looking for, here are the guidelines, here are the application dates, here's what the proposal should contain. So typically you want to look for something like that. Then the person who runs the program for the funding agency often is called a program officer. This person usually can be contacted for information. Pretty typically, a grant that's submitted to any kind of organized funding agency goes through some sort of peer review process. And it might be a very elaborate process, it might be a very simple process, but the grant will be reviewed by some person or group of persons. Pretty typically, the grant budget can only request allowable costs. There's a whole list of what's not allowable, like liquor, like buying tickets to go to baseball games, like providing t-shirts and extra goodies. And so you'll want to know what are the allowable costs before you prepare the grant budget. And this will vary from organization to organization what's allowable. Some grants can provide meals, some can't. Some can provide transportation, some can't. So you'll want to know that. And then finally, the main repository for finding out about federal grants is called grants.gov. It lists all the grant opportunities, and it's also the mechanism by which grants are submitted. So if you're serious about looking into grants, you should probably take a look at grants.gov. It's very complicated, but it's what we've got. So if you want to do a grant, you have to figure out what kind of category the grant goes into. And remember, when I gave that diagram, I said you need a creative idea. Whatever it is, it's going to fit in one of these categories. So grants do support research. A lot of it is theoretical, but a lot of research is applied. And sometimes when you do a project grant, a service delivery, the funding agency also wants you to collect some data. So you might be doing research even with some project that's serving children. Curriculum development can be supported through grants, and this can be in a whole lot of ways. It can be informal, it can be formal. There are grants that support teacher training and continuing education. There are grants that support students at all levels. There are grants that provide equipment, whether it's educational or research. There are wonderful grants that support travel. There are grants that support construction, renovation, facilities. There are grants, and this might be something very pertinent to people working in extension, grants that support conferences and workshops. And these can be a whole array of conferences and workshops. They can be a one-time, they can be ongoing. And then there's a whole set of grants that support community outreach and public service. And then grants that require some sort of collaboration, whether it's with schools, colleges, universities, local government, not-for-profit organizations. So within the whole family of grants, this is pretty much how grants divide out, that there are these various types. And they can be more than one type combined. So in beginning to learn about grants, you have to figure out where does your creative idea fit. So you've got an idea, you found a funder, they've got money, they are supporting the kind of idea that you may want to do. Then you got to figure out how to put together a grant proposal. And it's gotten more and more and more complicated. I'm giving a workshop in a few weeks on the types of grant proposals that are out there, and I'll give much more detail than I can give here. But a lot of grant agencies now, before you can even submit a grant, you have to do a preliminary or pre-proposal. Basically, you're saying, here's my idea, and the agency will take a look and say, yeah, we like it, write us a proposal. Nah, we don't think so. Go away. So this pre-proposal is becoming more and more and more used. It can be a single page, it can be a couple pages, and pretty typically it's used as a screening device. And the agency is wanting to cut down on its work, it's wanting to discourage proposals that don't really have much chance. So that might be your starting point, that you have to do a very short pre-proposal. Sometimes it's not even a pre-proposal. An agency will say, well, send us your idea. Give us your concept. Give us a white paper. Tell us what your idea might be. Sometimes agencies use this then to come up with a funding solicitation. So they want to see what's out there. What kind of ideas do people have? So sometimes you might just have to put down your ideas without even having a grant opportunity to apply for. Sometimes private foundations especially call it a letter of intent or a letter of inquiry. And they say, tell us about your organization, tell us about your idea. And so it may not be as formulaic or as detailed as a pre-proposal. So that may be what you have to write. A full proposal, the longest one I ever wrote was 225 pages. If you're lucky, it'll be more in the 3 to 5 to 10 page, but they can be anywhere. Probably they're not going to be much less than 3 pages. But the agency will say how many pages. I'm working on one right now that's 60 pages, and it's due in about a month. So if you're lucky, and it's a lot of pages, you'll have a lot of time to work on it. Pretty typically, the proposal itself will have very specific details and components, but there also will be some forms that go along with it. There'll be a budget. There can be attachments like letters of support, like biographical sketches, like certification of a not-for-profit status. There can be, they sometimes even want your audited financial reports. There can be all kinds of things that are attachments. There might be a list of of if you've got an advisory board, who are these people? So there can be a whole array of attachments, and almost always there will be a defined format. So in the full proposal world, mostly what you will be writing is what are called unsolicited proposals, meaning the funding agency did not come to you and say, we want you. You are going to them and saying, we've got this idea. So pretty typically, that's what you're going to be writing. If you get the award, it might be a contract. It might be a subcontract where you get money from some other organization that applied for the grant. A solicited proposal means exactly what it says, that a funding agency reached out and said, we want you to apply. That might come after a pre-proposal or letter of inquiry or intent. A collaborative proposal means more than one organization is applying together as a team. A cooperative agreement is an arrangement where the funding organization is involved in running the project with you. So all of these mechanisms exist. And part of your learning how to write grants is figuring out what kind of proposal are you really doing, because they have different ways of being applied for and different ways of being managed if you get the grant. So what do you need to know about your sponsor ahead of time? You need to know that they want your project. And you need to know that they've got enough money to support your project. You need, basically, why do agencies give money? They give money because they have a mission to support. And so your project has to fit in with what they are charged with doing. You pay some attention to whether they've got a history of supporting projects like yours. And you need to find out if you can talk with them, confer with them, send drafts before you submit. Do they have a policy of consultation and openness, or do they say, just send us a proposal, don't bother us? So these are all things you want to find out ahead of time. So let's start digging into what else is required to support a good proposal. You cannot ask for a grant without some sort of backup, data, material. You can't just say, we need this project. You have to say, we need this project because. And so supporting data, it can be pilot projects you've already tried on a small scale, and you think, well, you know, this really works. So let's see if we can get some money to expand it. So it's very hard to go in fresh without having tried something about your idea. But supporting data might be local demographics. Who's the population you serve? I wrote 2 grants a few months ago for 2 rural fire departments. And we had to document how these grants, if you're asking for a new fire truck, how is this going to make a difference to the community? So you've got to have information about the community, about the kind of housing, about how many fires they've had before, about how many emergency calls they have. So your supporting data is going to have to show who your organization is, who are the populations you serve, what are some pieces of evidence that A, you need this project, but B, you can do this project. So it could be any of these things. It might be focus groups that you've gotten some people together who say, we would really like this project. Here's what we'd like you to do for us. So it can be, surveys are normally written, focus groups are normally in person. It can be that your local population has come forward and said, we really think if you could help us do whatever this local need is. You can also use national studies, federal reports, sometimes a literature search to find out what other organizations have done, what are best practices. So when you do your grant, you have to have some section where you document. And this takes time. So if you want to write a grant, here are the 5 questions. No matter where you're going, no matter what funding agency, you have to say, what is it you want to do? This is hard. It's hard to say precisely what it is you want to do, but you have to do that because that governs budget, that governs project activities, that governs project personnel, that governs outcomes. But then you also have to say, why do you want to? And it's not just we need or we want. You have to show that there's a good reason to do this project. And then you have to show how are you going to do it? How will you know if you succeed? This means you have to do some evaluation, some evidence. And then what are the benefits? You have to project and predict the benefits. So these are your 5 basic questions. Different agencies will ask it in different ways, but this is what you have to write about. And so when I work with people who have not written grants before, we use these 5 questions. And what you want to do is start writing. And I say 1 good paragraph for each question. And this will help you do several things. It'll clarify your thoughts. If you can't articulate in a good paragraph what it is you want to do, you're not grant ready. But this 2-pager, it could be a 1-pager, but it helps you start looking for grant opportunities because you've articulated these 5 questions. You might use this to send to a potential agency officer, funder, and say, here's my idea. Is this workable? Does this fit what you're looking for? So the 2-page document is a really good starting point. And it might turn out to be your full proposal. Here, for research projects, you might have to come up with a hypothesis. If we do this, we think that will result. And so usually research projects, but also service delivery outreach, you have to describe what the proposed impact is. You have to figure out, you also have to say, why are you the best person to do this? So you do have to explain who your project personnel are and that they're ready. And then always you have to say, what have we already done to get ready for this project? So this is kind of an outline of the various proposal parts. Every proposal part serves a purpose in the full grant proposal. So let's look quickly. Every grant proposal is going to have some sort of cover sheet. And that might be legalities. It might say the exact legal name of the applicant. It'll give the address. It'll give contact information. Sometimes you have to give your congressional district or your unit of government. So there will be a cover sheet. If the agency doesn't give you one, you make one. And then a good proposal provides a table of contents so that people know where they can find what's in the proposal. It's also a check for you that you included all the required parts. And so a table of contents, the agency may provide one or you may have to make one. And then every grant proposal has some sort of, you call it abstract, you call it summary, whatever you call it. It's a short description of what's going to be in the proposal, not the table of contents, which just lists the parts, but the abstract says, here are the ideas you're going to find. And here's the quick overview. Then almost all grants start out by saying, here is the issue we're dealing with, here's why we need a grant. Some agencies call it problem statement, some call it the need statement, but you have to articulate, nobody gives you money for a perfect situation. They give you money because you want something changed. And so the problem or the need statement is, here's where we are. We have this situation, these issues, and the grant will help us fix these. And so then from defining what your problem is, then you say, okay, we've come up with these goals, these aims, these objectives. And goals or aims might be broader. Objectives might be very specific, that we will work with 25 youth in 3 communities. We will provide these services. And we expect at the end that there will be some measurable differences. Then probably 50% of your grant, half of your grant is going to be, how are you going to do this? What are you going to do? Where are you going to do it? And so that's, almost everybody can write their work plan or their activities. The hard thing is coming up with objectives or coming up with the need. Then after you've said, here's what we're going to do, then you say, along the way, we're going to keep records, we're going to track, we're going to find out whether what we propose is working. And then pretty typically, a grant application expects that you will share what you've done. And so somewhere you have to write about how will you disseminate what you did. And then usually there are some supporting documents in a grant. The facilities, you might have to explain where you're going to do this, what building, what room, what kind of IT tools, what do you have that's going to allow you to carry this out? And then you have to write about the people who will do this project. You have to provide the money. And usually the personnel description is more what the project management, what the team will be, who does what. The biographical sketch pretty typically is like applying for a job, listing education, listing experience. And then you might, in some grants, have some references, you've consulted some of the data, and there may be various appendices, attachments. So this is the typical set of components. Almost every grant will have them in some way. They might be longer or shorter in certain grants. There might be some of these omitted. There's some grants where they say, we will give you $5,000. You don't need to provide a budget. Almost always, these will be the standard components. So what do? You give it a title, you find the funder, you start writing the preliminary material, and this is your standard process. Ideally, you will write several drafts, you will submit them to various people to take a look, you'll revise, you'll edit, and you will send this thing off, you'll submit it on time, and then you wait. So pretty typically, when you present the proposal, it'll be in this order, which relates to that chart that I just showed you. Pretty typically, there's a standard format, a standard presentation sequence, but when you develop it, what you really have to start focusing right away is, why is this important? What's the need? What's the significance? And you kind of work in a different order as you write the proposal from the order in which you submit. And one of the last things you will write will be the summary or the abstract. So let's talk about, how do you define that there is a need or a problem? You need to define, what is it? Is the problem that people in your region, your county, are struggling to find jobs? Is that a problem? Well, if it's a problem, you need to get your arms around it. You need to say precisely, what is the problem? Is it that 18 to 25-year-olds in your county have an unemployment rate of, say, 12%? That's data, that's documentation. You need to articulate precisely what the problem is. And the where, is it certain communities? Is it countywide? Is it regional? So you need, when you're writing the opening of the grant, you're saying, here's the situation we're trying to address. You need to be clear, precise, and you need to say where it is. Now, does that where mean it's just isolated to your county? Is it something that's statewide? You need to give a context. And then you need to say why. Why do we think this is an issue? Because if you can't answer the why, then you can't figure out what you're going to do about it. Because why leads to what would be some remedies. To what extent might have to do with how many people, it might have to do with how long, it might have to do with how do you know about this issue. And so you really need to be very clear and very precise about what the problem is. It might be gender, is it male and female both? Are there certain populations that have the problem more than others? But the idea is that you need to articulate to the funder precisely what the problem is and that you've done some homework. And then you need to show, have you ever tried to do anything about this? If you have, what have you done? Have other people tried to work on it? And if so, why is this still a problem? And so these are all topics that need to be addressed in the needs statement. It might turn out to be only a couple paragraphs. It might turn out to be a couple pages. And then you have to say, well, why do you think you can make a difference? If this problem exists, if it's been around, if other people have worked on it, how come it hasn't gone away? And so this is part of what you set out, and you try to describe it in a way that the funder says, okay, I get it. This is an issue, and this does fit what we support. And so we're interested. Tell us more. And so then, once you've articulated this problem, then you start saying, when are you going to do something about it? And when can be this week, next month, it can be over a year. This goes to your timeline, because in a grant, you have to say, what will be your plan over time? And you need to say, where are you going to do these activities? How are you going to do them? Who are the people involved? For how long will you do each of them? And so this is your plan. And you actually literally answer these questions. And you do them, my advice generally is you have to write them in enough detail that if you couldn't do it for some reason, somebody else could. And so it really is a clear work plan. There might be timelines, physical timelines that you show. There might be an organization plan for how the people all work together. And so this is really a very important part of the grant proposal. So what else you need to be thinking about as you're writing this grant is how do you show the big picture after you've defined your plan of action? Then you have to write this abstract, this little document that shows what your big picture is. And what we want to do in an abstract is you want to give the reader, this is the first thing they see. So the very first sentence of an abstract is, this is a one-year project that is designed to work with 50 at-risk youth in Washera County, where I grew up. And so you want the very first sentence to say, this is what the project is about. And then you need to say in the second sentence, this project is important because, and what we're going to do over this 1 year is. And so the abstract is really kind of taking the proposal in its outline form and putting it into a paragraph. Usually you want to say the target population, you want to say where, and you want to say, we believe that at the end of this project, we will show that. So abstracts are hard to write, and you don't write them until you've written the whole proposal. But this is, usually agencies don't give you a lot of instruction how to do the abstract. So what I've given you is a pretty decent outline of how you can write a good abstract. So pretty typically it can be one paragraph up to a full page. Pretty typically you want to keep the sentences short. Every sentence adds a new piece of information, and you don't take it from the proposal. You take it from parts of the proposal and you construct a new document. Pretty typically it's non-technical language. You don't talk about budgets or dates or the name of your organization. It's a nice little summary of the project. So how long does it take to write a grant? Ideally, you've got a couple months. And in those couple months, you get the guidelines, you read them very carefully, you start making an outline of what you have to write, and you start doing your background research, you start writing, you give it to people to read, and pretty ideally, you can be doing your budget narrative, all of these other things, say a month in advance. 2 weeks in advance would be nice if you could do your final proofreading and editing. And then the last week, you do your final review, you upload it, you submit it, and you celebrate, you relax, you get some sleep, and then you wait. So this is an ideal timeline. Some agencies have deadlines that are open, are available. You know that in 3 months there's going to be a deadline. Other agencies are unpredictable, and they announce a proposal, a request for proposal, and you've got, say, 30 days. So ideally, you want to be planning out that you've got a couple months to work on it. Plus, you do other things. You don't write grants for a living. I do, but you don't. So you want as much time as possible. How long does it take to write? Can you write a really good 5 pages in 1 day? Probably not. Most people struggle to write, and you'll get some ideas down, but they won't be your keeper ideas. They'll be a draft. So giving yourself a couple of weeks at least to write is probably the minimum. I have written things in just a couple days, but they're not good. So once you get this thing written, what do you do with it? Some grant agencies still use hard copies. You put together a paper document. It has signatures on it for your organization. It's got a budget. It's a bundle of paper, and you postmark it or you express it. It's not used very often. A few agencies still do use hard copy. Pretty typically, you submit multiple copies, so the reviewers all get their own copy. And it can be a due date, meaning it's got to be on their desk by the deadline. It can be a postmark date, or it can be open, just submit it whenever you choose. So some private foundations have open deadlines. You just submit it when you're ready. So that still exists, but not very common. Most funding agencies, whether they're private foundations, state or local agencies, and the federal government, use electronic applications. So pretty typically, it's one copy that you upload. It might be you upload it as a single PDF document. It might be that you upload it in parts following their electronic process. So pretty typically, there's a hard deadline, time specific. It might be, say, 5 o'clock Washington, D.C. time. It might be 4 o'clock Madison time. Some agencies have what they call an application window, that if you get it in within this 2-week period, it's on time. Grants.gov is the mechanism for all federal agencies, but a lot of the federal agencies have their own systems. So part of what you need to find out way back when you get that request for a proposal, you need to figure out what's going to be the submission process and who can submit. Pretty typically, there's only one person or one authorized office in an organization that can be the button pusher. It's usually the person who's the legal signature, and that button pusher is not the individual who writes the grant. So you need to find that out. Who is your authorized submitter? And how long will it take to upload all these documents? What will happen once it's submitted is the receiving agency will verify that it got in on time, that it's got all the parts that were required, and it's got all the certifications and compliances. And what can happen is it gets rejected for not meeting any of these requirements. Or if you're really lucky and you submit ahead of time, they might say, well, you've got time to fix it. But this is a kind of nerve-wracking part of the process. Just another tip, if your application has a lot of images or graphics or pictures or color, that can take longer to submit. I lost one grant that got submitted 8 seconds late because it took a long time to roll through the submission process. It had a lot of pictures. So be aware of that. So what happens? You write a grant, you're really pretty happy with the content and the organization, you think you've made a good case, you've got a solid budget, you've got competent people to run it, so you submit the thing, and then what I said in an earlier slide, you wait. What happens is the grant will be received by the funding agency. It will be assigned to someone or someones to review. In federal agencies, the process is usually peer review, meaning you're going to be reviewed by people and organizations like yours. And the goal is that it's fair, it's transparent, and it's judged by people who have skills to judge. Usually, the reviewers cannot have any kind of conflict of interest. Usually, you don't know who they are. No, I review for the U.S. Department of Education. I'm not allowed to review grants from Wisconsin. It's considered a conflict of interest just to review from my own state, the assumption being that I might give them an unfair advantage. So almost always, reviewers of grants have to state if they have a conflict of interest, or there will be a process where they're judged as having a conflict of interest. Now, when I moved from Illinois to Wisconsin, theoretically, I shouldn't have been reviewing grants from Illinois because I'd worked there for 17 years, but that was not a standard that got caught. So the conflict of interest can be somewhat arbitrary. Usually the review systems are tweaked and improved based on experience. Not all agencies, though, use peer reviewers. The Department of Defense uses its own internal staff. They don't send the grant proposals out. Private foundations pretty typically might be reviewed by staff, or they might have a board of directors who reviews, or family foundation, it might be just people in the family. So you want to find out ahead of time who is going to be reviewing and who is not going to be names. It's going to be what kind of process, what kind of review process. Some agencies use several layers of review, and some agencies define peers differently. So this is part of your homework if you get interested in writing any kind of grant. So here's the deal. If you go to federal grant agencies, it's going to be 6 to 9 months, which seems ridiculous, but they get many more applications in than smaller agencies. It takes a longer time. And so you're going to count on probably 6 months minimum. State, my experience is anywhere from 3 to 6 months. It can be shorter. It can be as little as 3 weeks to 6 weeks. Private foundations can be anywhere from 1 month to several months. So bear in mind that when you write your grant and you say, here's our activity, here's our timeline, here's what we want to do, that you have to keep in mind your start date is going to be determined by the agency and by when they announce their decision. Keep in mind also that any government grant is going to be based on the fiscal year of that funding agency. Federal fiscal year starts October 1st. The state fiscal year, I think it's July 1st, I may be wrong. And so you need to prepare your grant with the idea that you're going to be funded, probably the decision will come within the fiscal year that you apply. And the project may start in that fiscal year or the next year. So this is also part of your homework. If you're writing grants, how long will it take to review and when can be the first start date of your project? Private foundations, they can take whatever time they choose, and there's usually some flexibility in negotiating with them about the time and the start date. What else happens after the review? You're going to get notified. And they'll say, yes, we want to fund you just the way you submitted. We like what you did. We like your budget. We like your timeline. We like your activities. So that's the best case. The worst case is, sorry, thank you. We got many more applications than we could fund. The middle case is, we like what you're doing, but we want you to make some revisions. And so can you change your budget? Can you cut out a couple project activities? If you do that, then we'll make a decision. So that's negotiation, although there's not a whole lot of negotiation on your part. It's pretty much the funder saying, take it or leave it, can you accept these terms? Now, if they say, we're not going to fund you, and they're pretty definite, that might mean you cannot revise and resubmit. If the funding decision, though, makes clear that we would encourage you to revise and reapply, do it. They mean it. So read the funding decision very, very carefully. And the first response is usually, well, they don't like it. I'm going to go away and not try them again. No, you really should, unless they've clearly indicated that it's not a good idea. So almost always you'll get a written decision. Sometimes you get a phone call. And the written decision usually is email. Rare to get a real hard copy letter. And usually if you're awarded, there will be terms and conditions that you have to obey. And if you're working with a federal agency, almost always you will get the reviewer comments, what they thought was good, what they thought was not good, but not always. So that's something also you want to find out ahead of time. What kind of response will we get? Usually, if you're applying for a grant and you get this funding decision, usually it's final. You usually cannot challenge their decision. In fact, it's probably not a good idea to try to challenge. You can certainly, if you're not funded, contact the agency and say, can you tell us more? Can you give us more ideas about what we could do to improve the next time? But challenging usually doesn't do any good. So who reviews grants? It depends on the agency, but pretty typically they want someone who knows the field, who's an expert in the field. For research projects, almost always the reviewers are at the doctoral level. For other kinds of projects, often agencies will seek people not only with experience, but usually with at least a degree It might be a master's degree, it might be a bachelor's, but the idea is that this is not just someone off the street, it's someone with some education and some experience. A lot of times, people who have received a grant then get asked to be a reviewer. So sometimes a person on a comparable funded project will be asked to be a reviewer. Most funding agencies, whether they're federal, state, local, private, want some sort of diversity in the reviewers. They do look for gender diversity, they look for ethnicity diversity. Federal certainly looks for geographic balance. They want experience. They look for different types of organizations, and more agencies are beginning to look for an age distribution with the idea that more junior people bring a perspective that more senior people do not. So pretty typically, the reviewers ideally have this kind of diversity. So some final thoughts. I didn't learn how to write grants easily, and I've been working at it for my whole career. So successful grantsmanship really is a lifelong process. You keep getting better at it, you get more experience, you get more resilient about applying. So it takes a while to learn how to be really good. Very few people strike on their first time out. Some people do, but very few people do. So if you're going to jump in, jump in. You won't get a grant unless you try. So I really recommend trying and seeing what happens. And almost all proposals are unsuccessful the first time, but so what? Revising works, resubmitting works. If you can become a reviewer, it's an incredibly good experience to teach you what a good grant looks like. And I maintain that proposal development is an art because it involves writing and thinking and creativity, but it's also a science. It's got a process, it's got steps, it's got recognizable components. There are skills that can be learned. So I would submit that it's an art, it's a science, and today is a good start on getting involved in the wonderful world of grants. Grants make such a huge difference, so I encourage you to try. And I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has questions.
If you are on the list line, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. If you're watching on YouTube, drop me an email and I'll ask Marjorie that way. And my email is nicole.piechowski@uwex.edu. I do have one question for you, Marjorie.
Okay.
So do you have any recommendations on
Well, I've spent my career working in higher education, but all three organizations I worked with were really interested in collaborators. So I would say, depending on the kind of collaborator you want, start with a local campus if that's the kind of expertise you need, but also sometimes just putting the word out there by going out and speaking, by even putting a little article in a local newspaper. There are lots and lots of ways, but depends on the kind of collaborator you need and want. If it's expertise, specific expertise, as I suggested, you might need to go to a university campus. If it's local talent, as I said, get the word out, put an article out there, go around, give public talks. Can you follow up and say what kind of collaboration you're looking for? Well, schools are always a resource. Teachers in schools are always committed to their community. They've got talent, they've got education. So that might be a starting point. Maybe it's even something like a chamber of commerce, maybe it's some sort of local economic development organization. But I would say look at what the community has to offer and who might be the thought leaders and the action leaders, and try to get them engaged. Sometimes a really good strategy is to form some sort of advisory group or advisory council or citizens group. I'm a big believer in getting out into a community and making your needs known. So I think any of those could work. Anything else? Ah.
The Funding Hub website as soon as I get back to my office to be able to do that. So we're gonna end the broadcast.